Thank you, Dory. Welcome to day 2 on the Maternal Lifestyle Study, and thank you all for joining us today. Hopefully you had an opportunity to attend the day 1 presentation yesterday. As you may have gathered from that presentation, the Maternal Lifestyle Study, or MLS, it contains a wealth of data, which can be very useful for addressing research questions. However, when you go to actually analyze the data, particularly new users, could be overwhelmed by just the sheer number of data points and measures that are included in the study, which is part of what it makes it useful. So my goal today is to go through and provide some information that I will hope will help make that process of analyzing the data a little bit easier. So let me switch to my next slide. Here are the topics I'll be covering today. I'm going to start with a very brief reminder of the study objectives and design, and then the bulk of the time I'll be talking through different measures that are included in the MLS. And I've broken those up into 4 categories: the prenatal or neonatal early stages, and then the child and adolescent outcomes, which is a large amount of the measures, as you might expect, and then some family or household factors, and then finally community factors. Interwoven throughout my discussion, I'm going to give you examples from our research where we have used these different measures, just to give you an idea of the kind of analyses that can be done and hopefully to spark some ideas for your own research. And then finally at the end, I'll go through some of the considerations you should keep in mind when you analyze this data. So as a reminder, the Maternal Lifestyle Study was designed to examine the outcomes of children who were exposed to cocaine and or opiates prenatally. And it follows the children from birth to 16 years, so it's a longitudinal study. And it was conducted beginning in 1993 and ended in 2011. There were 4 sites that participated in the study: Brown University, University of Miami, University of Tennessee at Memphis, and Wayne State University. So we had some geographic diversity in the sample, and it had various funders throughout this time period. The total sample size is 1,388 infants. These are split into 658 that were cocaine or opiate exposed, and then a comparison group of 730. And a question people have a lot of times is, why are those numbers not match? And it had to do with the study design and the fact that they could replenish the comparison group but not the exposure group. So that's why those don't match. Among the exposed group, most of those were exposed to cocaine only, 543. There were 57 with cocaine and opiate exposure, and then 58 that were opiate only. And that comparison group, they were matched on race, gender, and gestational age. Okay, so I wanted to talk briefly about the data collection timeline. As I mentioned, this is a longitudinal study. These 2 timelines, the top and bottom, are in different units, and they're not to scale, but it gives you the general idea. The top one is in terms of months. And that's phase 1 and 2, those early years. They did a lot more measures or visits during that time because the children were changing rapidly. So in that first year, there are, I believe, 9 visits. And then moving on to phases 3, 4, and 5, those visits were primarily once a year, although there were half-year measures at 4.5 years and 5.5 years. So it's important when you look at this data to remember whether, what time period you're looking at. And a lot of the data sets are labeled, or the forms are referred to in terms of months or years. And throughout my presentations, to make you aware of what time point the measures are available at, I've indicated, let's say, M4 for 4 months, or Y9 for 9 years. Okay, and then just a few nitty-gritty details on the data sets. So each of the data sets are labeled according to form number. And the MLS forms begin with the abbreviation NC. So for example, Form 20 is NC 20. I know that doesn't make a lot of sense, but that's how they're labeled. And then beginning in phases 4 and 5, some of the forms have 4- something or 5-. So for example, NC 4-049 was phase 4 form. In addition to the raw data sets that have these form numbers, there's also supplemental data sets. And those primarily contain scale scores. And those are labeled with the form number followed by _ scored. So for example, the data set NC78 _ scored are the scores for the child behavior checklist, which happens to be form NC78. Okay, so now I wanted to talk about some of the measures that you may want to include in your research. And given the design of the study, one that comes up quite often that people want to use are the prenatal drug exposure variables. And there are 5 types of prenatal drug exposure that were measured: cocaine exposure, opiates, tobacco, marijuana, and alcohol. And these variables are included in a data set I believe called exposure. And I've listed the variable names for you there. They each start with EXP. So example, EXPC is cocaine exposure. The nice thing about these dichotomous variables is that they're available for basically all the participants, with the exception I noted marijuana is missing for 2 participants. So you don't have to worry about missing data in your analyses. In terms of how these were defined, those primary exposure variables, cocaine and opiates, were defined based on self-reported use and or the presence of metabolites in the meconium. So then another variable that you may be interested in, as I mentioned, there's a lot of interest in cocaine exposure with this data set, is a 3-level variable called CokeLev, which has high, some, and no cocaine exposure. And this is all based on the maternal self-reported use during the first trimester of pregnancy. So for example, high cocaine exposure is that the mother said she used cocaine 3 or more times per week. Some is some exposure, but less than 3 times per week, and then there's no exposure. The one caveat with this variable is that it's only available for 1,164 participants. That's because it's based on maternal self-report, and it is the mothers that were present at 1 month. So what I usually recommend is to start with those dichotomous variables on the previous slide, and in particular the EXPC variable. So first look, is there a difference between those with no cocaine exposure versus any cocaine exposure? And then drill down to this dose response effect with this level variable. In addition to prenatal drug exposure, we also have other factors around that time period, the prenatal and neonatal factors. These are primarily in the phase 1 data set. These include things like birth weight, gestational age, whether there was a multiple gestation, did the mother receive prenatal care, what was the mode of delivery, and then maternal age. And that's just a few of the ones that are there. Okay, so then I wanted to move on and talk about child-adolescent outcomes, and this is where a bulk of the measures are in the data set. I've split this up in this little wheel diagram into different areas. So for example, more the mental quality of life, things like depression, anxiety, aggression, and then more physical factors, so things like growth, blood pressure, sleep, and then the social arena, things like their friendships, what are their relationship like with their family, did they experience bullying, and then the last category is what I was referring to as more the academic or school-related outcomes, so things like behavior in the classroom or academic aspirations. And so I was going to walk through each of these areas. So first, as I mentioned earlier in that timeline slide, there are quite a few visits in that early childhood stage. And here are some of the measures that are available, specifically looking at early childhood development. For example, those of you familiar may know the Bailey measures. There's Bailey mental, motor, and behavior in each of those areas, and those are at, well, 12, 24, and 36 months. There are also measures on the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, for example, or several on motor measurement, things like the posture and fine motor or the Peabody motor scale. And then behavior, there's also an infant behavior questionnaire. Now, one early childhood scale that I specifically wanted to mention, because it's one of the unique features of MLS, is that they included at the 1 month visit a comprehensive measure of neurobehavioral development and signs of stress. I haven't seen many that have so much detail about the child development as the ends. This is referred to as the ends. And so that's Form NC42, by the way. So these are the 13 subscales that are included on the ends. So these are things like attention and habituation, handling, non-optimal reflexes, quality of movement, stress abstinence. As you might expect, there was a theory that these kids with prenatal drug exposure may exhibit different patterns on some of these areas. So I wanted to talk briefly about some research we did with the ENDS scale. And we were interested, so there's these 13 different subscales. For this analysis, we used 12 because one wasn't relevant for our sample. But we wanted to know whether or not, it's difficult to analyze all of these different subscale scores and to make sense of all of that, although it's very good for getting into the details. But for this analysis, we wanted to know, well, can we collapse this into a smaller number of endpoints? And we were particularly interested in whether we could identify groupings of children who had similar patterns in development across those different subscales. So we ran a latent profile analysis to identify profiles on the end subscale scores. And then we wanted to see, well, can you use a child's development at 1 month to predict how they will be doing in later years? So here are the results. And I think Barry covered this, so I won't go into a lot of detail, but these are the profiles that we came up with. And we found 5 distinct profiles. The one that really stands out is the one in red, this class 5, where this group is very different than the others. They have very low quality of movement, high stress abstinence, high excitability, low self-regulation. And when we looked at that class, the outcomes for that class compared to the others, we saw that they had worse outcomes, for example, on the Bailey MDI at 1 and 2 years, the child behavior checklist at 3 years. They had lower IQ at 4.5 years, and they had some concept problems at 4 years. So we were able to see this relationship between this early development and later outcomes. And that may, for those of you interested in that time period, that may be a scale you're interested in. Okay, so starting with moving on with more of the mental quality of life or mental health kind of arena on that wheel are some, what I was referring to as cognitive measures. So for example, there's a CANTAB battery, which is a pretty comprehensive computerized battery, and that's available at years 9, 11, and 13. And that covers several different areas, so attention, executive functioning, memory, emotion and social cognition are some of the areas that are covered on that CANTAB. There's also a Connor scale at a few time points that can be used to look at ADHD. If you're interested in processing speed and executive functioning, there's a trail making test at year 7. And then a measure of inhibitory control, there's a Stroop-like day-night test at years 5 and 7. And I should have mentioned, I try to, throughout these slides, indicate the form number so that you can refer back if you want to find the data set. So for example, the trail making test is NC 109, you'd be looking for that data set. Okay, then there are several measures on what I was calling mental health or regression. One in particular that I wanted to point out was the Diagnostic Interview Schedule for Children, or DISC. This is Form NC 4005. This is available at 3 years, 8, 11, and 14. And the nice thing about this assessment is that it includes a number of symptoms or diagnoses, mental health related ones. And I've just given you a few examples here. So things like oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder, panic disorder, depression, anxiety, but there are many more in the DISC. Another couple measures that I wanted to highlight are the Pediatric Symptom Checklist and the Child Behavior Checklist. And the nice thing about these is that they are conducted at many time points. So for example, the PSC is at years 8 through 15. And then the Child Behavior Checklist is on odd years from 3 to 15 years of age. And those are nice for looking at how the child's trajectories are over time. And both of those, they're similar measures, although the CBCL is longer, but they do have some common scores such as externalizing, internalizing, and attention, and then a total problem scale. But those are ones, if you're interested in longitudinal analyses, you may want to check out those. And then finally, I wanted to mention some other mental health aggression-related scales. So if you're interested in depression or anxiety, at year 7 there was a child depression inventory. The short moods and feeling questionnaires related to depression. There was a screening for anxiety at years 12 through 15. And then in terms of aggression or antisocial behavior, there's a measure of direct and indirect aggression at years 12 and 15, and then the antisocial processing screening device at those same years. Okay, so here's another example from our research where we used, in this case, the Pediatric Symptom Checklist from 8 to 12 years. And we were interested in primarily what are called positive screens on that measure. So those who had a score of 28 or higher were considered to have a positive screen, meaning that they had exhibited significant problem behaviors based on the PSC total score. And we specifically wanted to look at, do PSC scores or positive screens differ for those with the children with prenatal cocaine exposure or other kinds of prenatal exposures. So moving on to the slide, you can see, for example, on the left hand is by prenatal cocaine exposure, and this is that 3-level variable, so no, some, and high cocaine exposure. And we see for all except for year 10, those with high exposure were much more likely to have positive screens. Interestingly, we saw a similar pattern in terms of tobacco exposure, where at each of the years, those with high tobacco exposure also had more positive screens. So the next area where there's been quite a bit of interest in the MLS is in terms of risk-taking behaviors in the adolescent years. And I've included under this heading things like crime or violence, and there's a measure called Guns and Gangs, which is very descriptive of what it covers, and that's things like, you know, weapons, whether they have certain weapons, whether they are members of a gang or know people who are members of a gang. There's also a measure of police contact, so have they committed certain crimes, have they been arrested, have they had to go to court, things like that. There are also some measures looking at dating or sexual behaviors during that time period. There's a dating history questionnaire at years 12 to 15, and then specifically sexual behaviors assessment at years 14 to 16. And then finally, there's some questions on substance use, in particular a substance abuse subtle screening inventory at years 13 and 15. So here's another example of how we use this data. We are specifically interested in looking at risk-taking behaviors at 15 years and whether those varied by those with versus without prenatal cocaine exposure. You're probably getting the idea by now that's the primary interest of ours is outcomes by cocaine exposure. So looking at the next screen, we have, I've shown some of the outcomes that we looked at. For example, were they arrested? Did they use marijuana? And then for the sexual behaviors, we split our sample based on what we considered more early onset of those behaviors versus later onset. And after we controlled for other factors, we found that the differences between the cocaine exposed and the non-exposed remained significant for arrests and oral sex at 14 years or younger. So once we found this difference, then we wanted to try to explain what was causing that difference, or some of what might explain that. So we ran a path analyses to look at possible mediators. In particular, we were interested in inhibitory control problems. So if you look at these diagrams, the top measures are, or the top diagrams are the direct effects. So the direct effect from prenatal cocaine exposure on arrest, for example. And then the bottom diagrams have to do with, well, what if we have that path go through inhibitory control problems? Does that account for all of the direct effect of cocaine exposure on outcome? And we found that it did, there was some partial mediation where inhibitory control seemed to be explain part of the differences, but it wasn't complete mediation. So there's more that could be looked at there in terms of, you know, what's explaining those outcomes. So I've talked a bit about that kind of mental or psychological part of that wheel, and so now I'm going to move on to the social arena. And there are several measures looking at peer relationships and activities that the kids had, and again, most of these are kind of the adolescent ages. So things like talking about the friendships, so the quality of the child's friendships, and perceived loneliness in the children. Those scales are year 10. There's also the parents' report on the child's close friends at years 12 and 15, and this network of relationship inventory at year 12. There are the kids' perceptions of the other kids in their class at school at years 12 and 15. And then finally, there are some questions about their extracurricular activities at years 9 through 12 and then 14. Oh, I'll go back for a second. One other thing that you may want to look at that I didn't have on here is a scale called Things I Have Done and Things My Friends Have Done. So those of you who are interested in either, you know, social impact or these risk-taking behaviors may want to look at those. So for example, the relationship between what the kids have done and what their friends have done, or, you know, maybe later outcomes. So then moving on to more of the physical or medical types of outcomes. Those of you who are interested in more of these outcomes will certainly want to look at this medical history form in C28 or 5041, which is collected at not quite, but almost every time point. And it includes quite a bit of information about the kids, including their height and weight, their blood pressure, doctor visits they may have had, ER visits, different diagnoses or medications. So that's one you may want to review. There are also some other measures that are related to these more, you know, medical outcomes. Things like diurnal and stress cortisol. at 11 years, which I'll talk a little bit in a minute. There's a nutrition measurement, and I don't recall the year for that one, but that includes a lot of detailed information about their nutrition and different nutrients and vitamins. For puberty, there's Tanner staging, and that's 2 different forms for girls and boys. There are some actigraphy measurements on physical activity. There are questions on sleep habits. In the earlier years, there was a questionnaire on, or some information on lead exposure. And then in the adolescent years, there was a measure of HIV testing, some questions on that. So here's another example from our research where we looked at diurnal cortisol at 11 years. And in case any of you are not familiar with diurnal cortisol, most people follow a normal pattern to cortisol levels. So usually in the morning, the cortisol peaks. It's at its highest point there, getting you ready for the day. And it will drop sharply to the afternoon and then kind of taper off through the evening. However, there was some work suggesting that children in high-stress environments can have an atypical pattern to diurnal cortisol. And so what we wanted to look at in this study was whether or not our children who had high prenatal cocaine exposure had different patterns than those without exposure. So at 11-year visit, salivary cortisol samples were collected in the evening and then the following morning. So here are the results. This is a little different than the graph I showed you previously, but what we're looking for here is we expect the evening cortisol to be lowest and then a sharp rise up to the morning cortisol. And we see that those with no exposure or some exposure follow that expected pattern. However, those with high prenatal cocaine exposure have, their pattern flattens out, their curve flattens out. So they're not experiencing that big increase like they should. Okay, another way that we use some of that information I mentioned on that medical form was to look at obesity trends. In particular, we were looking at the 11-year data, and we wanted to know what would predict whether kids were overweight or obese at 11 years. And you can see the distribution here, and we had quite a few kids that were overweight or obese. We had 17% who were overweight and 25% who were obese at 11 years. And so we wanted to know, well, whether their BMI at earlier ages would predict where they ended up at 11 years, and then whether the number of times that they were overweight or obese in those early years impacted how they ended up at 11 years. And this was back before a lot of work had been done on this. I know more work has been done since. And we were particularly looking at these different stages, for example, preschool, so 2 to 4 years of age, early elementary 5 to 7, and late elementary 8 to 10 years, and how their weight during those time periods would affect their 11-year outcomes. So here's some the trend graphs, what we found. On the horizontal axis is their BMI percentile, and then on the vertical axis is the predicted probability of being overweight or obese at 11 years. And as you can see, for each one of these, the higher their BMI was at that earlier time point, the more likely the higher their probability of being overweight or obese at 11 years, like we expected. And you can also see that those curves get steeper over time. So there's a much stronger relationship between BMI at 10 years and BMI at 11 years, like we might expect, than there is between BMI at 24 months and BMI at 11 years. However, we still are seeing a relationship. And then we looked at the number of times that they were overweight or obese at each of those time periods. And as we saw with the graph, the closer you are to 11 years, so the late elementary versus preschool, the higher the odds of being overweight or obese. And we did find, in effect, that if the child was overweight or obese 2 or more times, the odds of being overweight or obese at 11 years was much higher. Okay, so moving on to the last kind of piece of that wheel, the academic or school outcomes. The MLS nice thing is that they have at year 7, 9, and 11 school visits where data was collected from the teachers. So, for example, and all the measures on this slide are completed by the teachers. So, for example, year 7, we not only have child behavior checklists from parents, but here we also have it from the teachers. And that was also done at the 9 and 11 visit. At year 7, there's also something called a taxonomy of problem situations, and then the Connor scale. So those of you interested in ADHD, you can also look at that from the teacher's perspective. At years 9, 11, there was a mock report card, so the teacher gave their ratings on the child's performance in different academic areas. They also talked about their work habits. There was a teacher observation of child adaptation. That's a mouthful. That looks at things like how does the child behave in the classroom, and then how do they behave when they're mad or angry. There's a teacher relationship questionnaire. So what kind of relationship does the child have with the teacher? There's the teacher's perception of the parent-teacher involvement. And then for those of you interested in more the social related outcomes, there is the teacher's perception of the child's peer network and social position. Other outcomes that are not completed by teachers, but I thought may be of interest to those of you who aren't interested in studying more of the academic or school outcomes. There were a few other measures I thought you may be interested in here on this slide. For example, there are some Wechsler forms on IQ tests at years 7, 9, and 13. There's some measures of what I was calling roughly achievement or ability. For example, the Woodcock-Johnson is at a few years. I believe that's the Woodcock-Johnson 3. And at year 9, there are measures of spoken language and phonological processing. And then there were a couple other measures that really didn't fit into those categories, but I thought may be of interest. So, for example, earlier I mentioned we have a teacher measure of parent-teacher involvement, but we also, in this case, have a parent perception of that parent-teacher involvement. And then there also a questionnaire on expectations or aspirations for the child at years 12 and 14. So at year 16, which is the last year of data collection for the MLS, that was an abbreviated visit, and there is a brief life school summary form with some of this kind of academic or school-related information. So things like whether the child or adolescent at this period was on the honor roll, took advanced placement or honors classes, received vocational training, to college credit courses or internships, things like that, or on that form. So here's another example of what we've done with the using some of the teacher forms. As I mentioned earlier, we have the child behavior checklist on both parents and teachers. So we were interested in looking at children's behaviors over time using the CBCL, and then we wanted to know, do kids with prenatal cocaine exposure have different trajectories over time than those who were not exposed? And then we also threw in this piece about looking at, do parents and teachers have the same perceptions of behavior, or do they differ? And to run this longitudinal analysis, we used latent growth curve analyses, which is a form of structural equation modeling. And here's the information we had from parents and teachers. At year 7, 9, 11, we had both, and in 13, we only had parents. So here's our model. In latent growth curve models, you have basically latent variables for the different parameters of the growth curve. So for example, the circles represent the intercept and slope of that growth curve. And so we have one for parents and one for teachers. And we've used their each of their measures in those boxes at 7, 9, 11, 13 years are the manifest or the measured variables. And then we were interested in these factors there in the middle and how those influenced these trajectories. In addition, we wanted to look at, well, how do parent measures relate to teachers' measures? So here are, it turned out that a linear curve fit, and so we have these lines. On the horizontal axis is the parent and teacher at the different time points, and this is, on the vertical axis are the CBCL externalizing scores. And so the main point here is that we found that those kids with high cocaine exposure exhibited more externalizing problems than kids with the none or no exposure. We also saw that there was a correlation between parent and teacher measurements or perceptions, but that the teachers tended to report more problems than the parents. And that's summarized here on this slide. So one thing I wanted to mention is that when you're doing these analyses, let's say we want to look at something like child psychopathology, as we were doing with the CBCL there. Often we look at child-level influences, for example, their gender, their temperament, things like that. However, it's important to remember the child doesn't live in isolation. So they're also influenced by, let's say, family-level influences, things like, maternal psychopathology or caregivers' drug use or domestic violence, and then that family lives within the context of a community. So community-level influence can also have an impact. So things like community violence or the neighborhood environment. So the nice thing about the MLS is that it has all of these different pieces. So I wanted to move on from the child-level measures to look more at family and community. So when we talk about family factors, a lot of times we, in these types of studies, we automatically assume, family means biological parents, or at least the biological mother. Especially when you're talking the babyhood, people tend to assume, the baby leaves the hospital with the biological mother and goes home. However, it's important to know that with our sample, particularly given, the drug use and the time period when this was happening, that may not be the case. So the baby could have been removed from the mother due to maternal drug use. So that baby may not have just gone home with mom. The baby may have been placed in some other types of care, so foster care, for example. And then let's say even if you had the kids that did go home with the biological parents, it's possible that there could have been issues in the home where there would have been Child Protective Services involvement, and the child could have been removed in a later year and put in foster care. There also could be cases where the child's not removed by CPS, but perhaps the mother or father can't care for the child, and so they're placed with an alternative caregiver, such as a grandparent or other relative or friend. So it's important when you look at things related to family or caregivers that you know who who is actually taking care of the child. So I've identified some forms that help you sort that out. For example, there's this, it's called the ACYF form. NC20, it changes numbers throughout, so it's 2021 or 5039. And it includes questions that help you look at the caregiver. So for example, who takes primary responsibility for the child's needs, and how involved are the mother or father? It also includes things like living arrangements, who lives in the home, is the biological mother in the home, is the child in a foster home or group home. And then finally, there's a form specifically related to CPS involvement. So for example, has there been a report or referral to CPS? Is the family under supervision, or have parental rights been terminated? Okay, so for some more information, I was not involved in this paper, but one of the MLS investigators, Henrietta Bada, worked on a paper where she looked at caregiver arrangements and changes over time, and then child outcomes. So she found that 20% of the children had changes in living arrangements between hospital discharge and 36 months of age. And that children in non-relative care had lower communication and daily living scores than those in relative care, and that each caretaker change the child experienced was associated with a more than 2-point reduction in communication and daily living scores. So that's something to keep in mind, that this disruption in caretakers can have an impact on the child. So further family factors that you may want to consider are things like the parent or caregiver mental health or physical health. For example, if you're interested in the child's weight and height, you may want to look at the measures of parent weight and height on the, I believe that's the medical history form. They're also, in years 10 to 15, specifically a form on parent blood pressure. In the more mental health area, there are some measures of things like parenting stress. That's at several time points. Affect depression inventory, or the brief symptom inventory will give you some information about the caregiver mental health. There are also some measures on parent or caregiver substance use. Primary one there is called the mother or caretaker inventory of substance use, and this is one where you need to make sure who is completing the form. So at 1 month, it is the mother who's completing it, and then at later time points, the caregiver, which may or may not be the mother. There's the addiction severity index, and then there was also another form on something else, but it also includes some services that the caregiver may have received, so things like drug treatment, but some other areas like mental health counseling or family planning or parent training. In addition, there are, in terms of family factors, there's also the parenting behaviors of the caregiver, or this feeling of family cohesion. And so at the younger ages, month 4 and then years 1 to 7, there's some information on the comfort strategies that the caregiver uses. Then there's also some measures related to how much the caregiver supervises or monitors the child. So things like a supervision questionnaire and a parental monitoring questionnaire, and those in the adolescent years. There's some things on family interaction tasks. There's also how the caregiver copes with child's negative emotions. That's at year 10. And there was at 8 months, and then later at the 4.5-year visit, a measure of child abuse potential inventory. Okay, I know there are quite a few family factors here, but the next one has to do with the home environment and the resources available to the family. So those could be things like the type of housing that they live in. That's on, I believe that's the ACYF form, which has where they live, who they live with, what type of housing it is. There's a family environment scale at year 6. And then one I thought was particularly interesting is this home inventory, which is 5.5 years, 9, and 13. And it differs for each of those time points, so depending on the child's age. So more of an early elementary, middle, and then later, or adolescent. And that has to do with things like what is the home environment like? So for example, does the child have access to books, or are they encouraged to read, or do they have a library card, or what kinds of family companionship is there? Are they, do they watch TV, or things like that? It's all about kind of the home environment. And then finally, family resources. So at years 5.5, 9, and 13, there's a family resource scale and the family support scale. The resources are more things like transportation. Do they have money? Do they have food? More concrete resources. And then the family support scale is more along the lines of social support. Okay, so moving on from family-specific factors to community factors. Here are a few forms that contain some information related to what is the community like in which the child is growing up. So I mentioned that ACYF form quite a bit. That's at almost all the time points. There's also a neighborhood scale, specifically at 10 months and then year 9. And then there's this survey of exposure to community violence at years 9, 12, and 15. And so these community factors can be positive related factors or negative. So some of the positive are things like, is there access to safe parks and playgrounds? Is it a close-knit neighborhood? What do you think the probability of success of kids in the neighborhood is going to be? Where the more negative factors are things like how many vacant buildings are in the neighborhood? Is there vandalism? Is there prostitution? Questions on community violence? Are there gangs in the area? Are they exposed to drug use or drug dealing? Okay, so then I wanted to talk a bit about some of the things that you should consider when analyzing the data. So just briefly touch on some of these. So the first is, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, these data were collected at 4 different sites. As you can see on the map there, they're mostly in the eastern, they're in the eastern part of the United States, but they are geographically diverse. So for example, we have up in Rhode Island, Michigan, Tennessee, and Florida, and those populations tend to be very different. And so knowing that the children are clustered within centers, you really need to take that into account when you run your statistical models. If you ignore that clustering, you could have bias standard errors and then improper conclusions in your results. So a couple options that we have used are, for example, there are only 4 centers, so we go ahead and include center as a fixed effect in a regression model. Or another option is to use a multi-level model and treat center as a level 2 variable. Another consideration to keep in mind is polydrug use. So a lot of our interest has been in, for example, are these kids that are exposed to cocaine, what is the impact of that on these later outcomes? However, it's important to keep in mind that these drugs are often not used in isolation. So, for example, I have on here, we had 606 kids who were prenatally exposed to cocaine, but they weren't just exposed to cocaine. Those mothers, several of them also used, for example, 10% also used opiates, 41% used marijuana, 73% used alcohol, and 84% used tobacco. So you need to keep that in mind. We tend to put these other types of exposure control for them in the model so that we can see what cocaine is above and beyond these other drugs. Another point that I've kind of mentioned throughout the presentation is to keep in mind who is responding to the measures that you're using. So make sure you verify which respondent it is, and sometimes this can change at different visits. So for example, is it a parent, it's an other caregiver, the child themselves, or a teacher? And again, I mentioned this, but the caregiver may not be the biological mother, and the caregiver can change from one visit to the next. Also, as the kids get older, there's a transition from just having parent-reported measures to then starting to have the kids complete some of the measures themselves. Another item to keep in mind when you're doing longitudinal analyses is that the time intervals vary for these visits. So they're not, nicely, neatly spaced at 1 year, although they are at the later time point. But if you're looking across the whole course from birth to 16 years, there are going to be a lot more visits clustered in those earlier years than later years. So for example, in the first year, there's 6 visits. And also, even if you look at the later years, they're not necessarily 1 year apart. There are a couple cases where there's a 4.5 and a 5.5 years. So you need to keep this in mind when you specify your time variable in some kind of longitudinal model, that you account for those disparities. And then the final consideration to keep in mind is missing data. As with any longitudinal study, there are cases that are missing, and you want to account for, how are you going to address that? Are you going to use imputation, or are you going to use something like full information maximum likelihood estimation, where it lets you use all of the data that you have rather than eliminating data points? So it's just something to keep in mind. But on a positive note, I did want to mention one of our studies where we looked at retention rates, and this paper was specifically focused on all of the efforts that went into retaining the sample for use by others that would be conducting longitudinal studies. But we did look at retention rates over time as a part of that, and we saw that there was a 75% retention rate from birth all the way to 15 years. That's where this paper was done, up to 15 years. And we then looked at retention by exposure, and we found no significant difference between those with cocaine exposure versus not in retention. As you can see on that graph, they're very similar over time. So at least when you're analyzing this, you don't have to worry that the exposed group dropped out more than the non-exposed or something like that, at least based on what we did here. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Jai, and she's going to talk a little bit more about accessing the data.
Hello, this is Jai Holtz. I'm representing the National Addiction and HIV Data Archive Program. Before I get started with my presentation, I just wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping here. I know that quite a few of you were able to attend yesterday, and so if you were here yesterday, then you have already seen my slides. And we are going to hold the questions for the most part to the end. I see that there's one here that I can address during the next section here. So I apologize that you may have to wait a little bit for questions, but feel free to zone me out for about the next 10 minutes or so, and then I'll be glad to answer the questions, and Carla will answer those questions too at that point. Yeah, so I appreciate the questions that have been coming in, and if you have any, please go ahead and add those now so we can take a look at them and be prepared to answer them when we're ready for that. So to officially start my presentation, I will be presenting on finding what you need in the maternal lifestyle study data, and I'll be giving you a little bit of an orientation to the NATUP website and also to the study homepage, and highlighting some documentation that will assist you. I'm going to connect it a little bit with some of the things that Carla talked about in her presentation, and then there'll be a little bit at the end about accessing the data. And I forgot to mention that I'm very appreciative to Carla for her great presentation, and I think that especially the areas throughout her presentation where she has the NC and then a number indicating the form, that will be something that you'll find helpful when you're trying to figure out which specific data sets you'll be needing. So I'm going to take you to the NATUP website and just tell you a little bit about what you can find here. So the main highlights that I want to tell you about are the search feature here at the top of the home page, which allows you to search for studies. Also, we have these tabs across the top for easy navigation that will appear on any page that you visit. And for this group, you might also find the quick links for data users towards the bottom middle of the page useful for finding things of interest. Now let's go to the Maternal Lifestyle Study page. I go there by just typing MLS and getting to the search result here. So on the study homepage, a few things worth noting are that we have this quick download feature that allows you to get all of the documentation at once, but we have quite a few files there, so you might find that it would be easier to selectively go through to figure out which data set documentation you need in the data sets section here of the page. You can also visit the table of contents, which gives you links throughout the study page for easy navigation rather than scrolling all the way down. Specifically for the methodology, you'll find some information about the sampling and the modes of data collection that were used, and on the ICPSR side, the extent of processing that we did to the data as we received it. So to tell you a little bit about the data documentation we have available for this study, I was going to bring you here to data set 0 study level file. This is a documentation file that I previously downloaded to give you a little preview here. So someone was asking if there was a place where you have a comprehensive list of all of the scales used over the 16 years. So you can find that information here in the documentation file. If you navigate through the table of contents here, we have a couple of data set indexes. One is is alphabetical by the assessment name, and you can see the form name here in parentheses, and also conveniently there's another version that's sorted by the form number here. And when you visit these data indexes, you can see the list of the assessments, and then across the top you have the years in which those were administered. So it's kind of a crosswalk here which will tell you at which waves that particular assessment was used. Something else you might find helpful here is this last section, the maternal lifestyle file merging by data set table, which was created by the NATUP staff. We combined some of the data sets as they came in from the PIs in order to make the curation of the studies a little bit easier and hopefully help with your ease of use of the data. And some of the things that you can find here are the phase and also the age in which that data occurred, the data set number. We combine these based on the source of the data, and you can find information here about the number of available variables from each assessment, and also how many cases there were, and further information about which site each, how many, divided up by site. So you can have the total number of cases and also the cases by site here in this table. Let's see, I just remembered too, I wanted to point out something else based on what Carla was saying when she was suggesting that people be careful to know who the source is of a particular data set. So if you go back to the data set index at the bottom of the data set index table, there's a source key, and that helps to indicate which group was answering that question. So you have the code here in this column. So for an example, if you saw AD, that's administrative data, and then you can search in here to find the code for if you're looking for administrative data. Okay, so in addition to this comprehensive documentation file that covers all of the data sets, there's also data set specific documentation files. Each file has a code book with the frequencies from that data set, and many of them also will have a questionnaire file which contains copies of the survey instruments that were used for that data set. Now I'm going to show you a tool for finding specific variables. So having gone to the table of contents and clicking the variables link, this takes me down to the variables search feature. You can see that there's over 45,000 variables in this study. And I want to just do a quick run through of how you might use this. So as an example, you could think about what a specific topic. I was thinking maybe you'd be interested in whether children were active in their communities. So how you might approach that is by typing in community into the search bar. And that returns a list of results indicating that there are 44 variables that contain the word community in them. So looking here at this first variable, we can see the variable name, the label for the variable, is name involved in community activity, and it tells us that it's taken from this particular data set, which is phase 4 year 9 mother caregiver report data. And so I previously checked the questionnaire file for this variable to confirm that when it's referring to name and the variable label, it's talking about the child. And the question text for this variable is study child's name involved in any activities in your neighborhood or community? Examples, music lessons, sports, Boy, Girl Scouts, camps, etc. So after visiting the questionnaire to confirm that this is what I want, I see that this particular variable appears in multiple waves. So I'm just going to quickly show you how you can use the compare tool here to to look across different waves for the same variable. So we have that variable in year 9. It also appears in year 10, and I believe it's in year 11 too. So let's say we want to compare those 3. I've selected them here on the left, and I'll press compare. Now that gives me 3 tables of the frequencies for those variables. And just for the sake of fun, we can look on the far left. We have the older ages moving to the younger ages, and we have a higher percentage here that said yes for the older ages than the younger ages. So as the children aged, there was a greater frequency of them responding that they were involved in a community activity. So that's just a really neat tool that can help you delve a little bit into the data and kind of get a sense of if it has what you need in it, and figure out which specific data sets you'll be needing. So now to move on to another tool here on the study homepage. We'll go back, and in the table of contents here, I'm going to related publications. So we also have this search feature that allows you to look at all the citations that are associated with this particular study. And we also ask that if you do end up using the data for your own research, that you please contact the ICPSR bibliography staff to let them know that you use the data for your published research. And let me give you the email address for that. If you for some reason did not remember where to find this, you can always just email NATUP as well with your publications, and we'll get it to where it needs to go. But that email address is bibliography@icpsr.umich.edu. So given the sensitivity of these data, the maternal, and the wealth of data that's there, the Maternal Lifestyle Study is restricted use, and that means that it contains indirect identifiers, it has disclosure risk. So this means that all of the documentation is downloadable, but in order to access the data itself, you're going to need to apply for access and get IRB approval or exemption. And this includes needing to complete a restricted data user agreement. So the steps for applying to access the data is to, first of all, read the documentation thoroughly and have a clear idea of which data sets you'll be wanting to use. The stronger argument that you can make that those are the specific data sets that you want, the more quickly you can move through the process of accessing those data. People who check that just want to know that you've done your due diligence to make sure of what you need rather than just kind of blanketly applying for a bunch of things. So you're going to want to read the restrictions notes under the access notes section of the study description, and in order to start going through the process, you can click on the access notes link in the study description, and that will take you to a place where you can apply online. So the restricted data use agreement is available as a PDF through the request system. It defines requirements of the investigator and the investigator's institution, as well as the obligations of ICPSR in providing the data. It requires signatures from the requesting investigator and a legal representative of that researcher's institution. So this is someone that can sign binding legal documents for the institution, and at an academic institution, this is typically a dean or someone higher. The RDUA includes the information in it entered into the access system. the IRB letter of approval or exemption for the project, and you'll also need to include a data security plan that you will create to outline how you're going to protect the data once you receive it. And it will also include other information that you add to our request system. So if you want to have a more detailed example of what this would look like, you can click the link here for a restricted data user agreement sample. And we have a bunch of additional training for accessing and applying to the data, including recordings of previous webinars. So if you go to the training tab on our website, you can find this webinar, find and apply for restricted use data from NATUP. It's easier than you think. And on the Find Data tab, you can find additional documentation as well. If you go to the Access to Restricted Use Data website page, we have a PDF tutorial and a video tutorial about how to find and access the restricted use data. So just wrapping up with this, these are the staff members we have here at NATUP, and we really welcome any questions that you might have now here at the end of the presentation, and also if you have follow-up questions after the webinars, you can go ahead and email us at natup@icpsr.umich.edu. And now we will go ahead and answer your questions.
So there was a question about stress. The question is, for stress, were there maternal stress assessments at baseline or just for children at 11 years? And there is a parenting stress index, form NC47, at 4 months of age, and then at 2.5 years, 5.5 years, 8 and 10 years. There's also a related scale on parenting daily hassles, form NC86, at years 4 and 4.5. There was a question about, are there any measures on mothers' tobacco use? There is in terms of prenatal tobacco use, that is in one of the exposure data set. There's also, throughout most of the time points, there are, I think it's the inventory of substance use, which was mentioned on an earlier slide. There are questions related to tobacco use. The last question I saw was, can you talk a bit about the stress abstinence component of the ENDS paper? The ENDS contains many questions on that stress abstinence scale, but they're on areas such as the child's skin. So they're pallor, modding, so on, things to do with sweating, spit up, sneezing, all of these, labored breathing, nasal flaring, so on. There's several different kinds of symptoms, so you may want to check out the some of the papers on the ENDS to get a more detailed look at what those questions are. And Jai, you've covered the one about the list of scales.
Yeah, so that list of scales is available in the documentation, the comprehensive documentation file. So if you want to see what's available across all 16 years, that's where you can find it. So we'll just hold on here for another minute or two in case anybody has another question that they'd like to add, and then we'll wrap up. Okay, it looks like we have one more question here. Are the analytical data support available? Oh, so if you, I mean, like, is there support for doing your analysis? So the NATUP staff can help a little bit with the navigation of the study and maybe helping to direct you a little bit to different parts. But for the actual analysis portion, I think you're on your own. So, yeah. So yeah, you'll have to go to the Stat Support Center at your local university or colleagues. Okay, so I hope that answered your question. Please feel free to email us if you have additional follow-up questions, and I think we're about ready to wrap up here. Is there any concluding remarks that you'd like to add, Carla?
No, just thank you all for attending, and I'm happy analyzing data analysis. So.
Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us, and this concludes our webinar.